So we're back to build it in Figma. And so just to kind of catch you up very quickly as to what we were working on, we're working on this imagine if the Nintendo Switch had like a streaming platform and then there was just all Switch games. It was just a made up idea, but we came up with this nav and we used a lot of like auto layout and components and things like that. So as you see here, we've got a few rudimentary components like an avatar, and we've got a nav item and an input. We got this little guy here. We got a separator, to kind of separate things. We didn't go too far with this. We didn't create a sub nav or anything like that, but we did kind of demonstrate what it would look like with constraints and all that to be able to set up a nav that could work for most desktop and maybe some tablet layouts. We also I set up these later just because I got really into it, this fictitious project of mine. And I found, Daisy and Yoshi, and I thought it would be cool if maybe this circle behind them, they could kind of hang over it. I thought that would be pretty cool, especially since Nintendo's a pretty friendly platform. And I thought bringing their characters in would be really cool. So we set up the nav within our desktop container, and then we set constraints on that nav component. So this here is a component instance, and we've made sure that within this desktop frame, we set it to left and right and top. And that way, if we resize the frame this way or whatever, it should just work. I actually didn't grab the frame there, I grabbed something else. And it should just work and expand to that. So that's kind of where we're at right now. That's the scene of where we came from the last stream. Ozra, if you want to do me a little favor, if we could find the link to the YouTube and the Figma file for that, that would be super cool. And we could just shoot that into chat. That way people could have a starting point. You're on it. This is why Ozra is amazing. And I try to do these things on my own, and it's so much better with her here. And her wicked wit. That's also great. Okay, so at this point now, this next little session that we're going to be working through, we're going to be talking about like putting content into this desktop layout, and then how can we make it adjust to a grid, and what would that content look like? So what we're going to do is we're going to be building a few components. You all may have seen sites like Twitch and Dribbble, Instagram, things like this. They all kind of rely on one specific construct, and that is specifically something called a card, like a card view. A card view has a little piece of media in it. Maybe that's an image, maybe that's a video, maybe it has an avatar associated with it, and maybe it's got a little description or a title or something like that. So we're going to work on that, and then we're going to also set up some grids here so that we can align these items to a grid. And then I've got a really super, pretty hidden Figma secret to share with you that I'm super excited about. I was like 1 week ago years old when I actually learned this, which I've been using Figma for a long time. So it's a little bit of a hidden feature. So we'll work on that. So first, let's just start really quickly with setting up a desktop grid. So I'm going to come over here to this desktop frame, and I am going to add a grid to it. Now, like I told you last time, all of these properties you can actually cut out. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy it, or I can actually hit Command X and cut that little thing out, just because I want us to start with a clean slate here. So if I hit plus here, it'll bring in the default grid, which is an 8-pixel grid. Really great to work with. We'll use it in just a second. But if you click this grid icon here, you can see there's other things under the hood. Now we want a column grid, and maybe we want to go ahead and my initial take on this when I was practicing this earlier was to do okay, what if we thought maybe there should be 4 or so of these columns, and we can also specify margin, maybe we want that 32 pixels off from the side. Maybe we want it to align with this little avatar here, so we want everything nice and lined up. Maybe it's 16. And then we can actually specify gutters here. So that's the space in between those grid columns. So we might come up with something like this that we want for our grid. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this and just paste back what was in my clipboard, because I had a 12-column grid. And you can see that I've specified some more things about this, like gutters are 32. I want to be able to do a margin of 64 pixels, and I can stretch. Within here, you can do lots of things. You can say like, hey, maybe it's like a 320 width column grid and it's center layout. So there's lots of ways to work with this. It's really powerful. One thing to note is that any one of these things that has this 4 little dot thing up here, you can actually create a style from it. So I can just go here and I can call this my desktop grid. I love this about Figma because now I don't have to keep copying this or copy pasting it to other frames. The other thing that I don't have to do is I don't have to, if all of a sudden I was like, oh no, I need to do like an 8-column grid, I could then go in and change that thing. Actually, never made it. All right, let's try this again. Yeah, you can see that it's definitely struggling and I have no idea why. So we're gonna go ahead and close it and we'll reopen it. Hopefully we'll be in a better spot. Every once in a while I've run into this where a style won't create. Oh, there it's working. I'm not sure what happened, but reloaded it and we're all good. Okay, let's start creating some cards. We're gonna jump right into the content creation portion of this. I could design my component on this, and I kind of want to because I have the grid and everything built in. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a frame. And I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to align this. It should snap to those grids, which is really handy. And I'm going to go ahead and add a background color on this. I don't want to do like the white shadowy card. Let's do something a little bit different. So I'm going to add a fill. I think it's like a light gray fill. I have added a few styles in here, so we could choose from these styles if they work. So we're going to use the subtle fill that I created, and all of these styles here I've created to kind of align with this Nintendo Switch brand. I'm going to go ahead and add some border radius here. Now if I just do arrows up and down, I'm going to go up and down by 1 pixel. But if I actually hold shift, you can see that it'll go up in increments of 8, which is my nudge amount. If anyone wants to know about nudge amounts, you can always go into preferences and go into nudge amount. This is the first thing I do whenever I set up a new Figma account is I set that sucker up to 8 because I hate units of 10. I don't know why we did that as designers. Why did we do that? I'm going to preach this gospel as long as I can. Okay, cool. So we've got this little card view frame, and let's add an image in. We're just going to use something. Yeah, we can use this here, or let's use this here. So I grabbed a few things just right off of twitch.com. We got some streamer avatars, and these are people that are streaming Nintendo content. So I'm just gonna grab this image. I'm gonna hold Alt. Let's just come on up here. And I'm gonna just bring it in here. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm just gonna try to put it in there. I can see now that I'm really going to need some kind of grid to help me align this because right now I'm just trying to figure it all out. So I'm going to take these 2 items and I'm going to hit Shift A to create an auto layout frame. I did this little mistake on purpose just to kind of show you how sometimes this works. You may think that it'll take this background color because that's the way that it works with text, but it doesn't work that way with the frame. So what I might do instead of that is actually drop this image into this frame. Osra, you can always interrupt me too. Happy to answer people in the flow here. What I can do now is I can come to this frame and hit the plus on auto layout, or I can simply hit Shift A and it'll also do the same thing. It'll also create auto layout. Now auto layout has some constraints here. Maybe I want this to be 16 here and then 16 there. And then I can actually just stretch this way, but you can see that that image isn't really doing much. So what I can also do here is just stretch this child to left and right. This little stretch left and right actually gets exposed as soon as it knows that it has an auto layout parent container. And so I can stretch that left and right. And now I'm all set here. I'm going to turn off this main grid here just so I can see the visuals of what's happening here with this little card. All right, let's go add some more. Let's add some more components into this because we don't just need an image on the screen. We're going to need quite a few more things.
Hey,
So,
Raji.
yeah, right here.
Why are we doing increments of 8?
Oh, it's a good question that a lot of people ask. So a long time ago when I started designing, I just started with 10. Uh, but as I started becoming an icon designer, and then I started becoming, here, let's actually just do a little example of this. We'll just create a little mini frame right here. And I'm gonna go ahead and just add actually, you know what? I'm just gonna use the pixel grid. As I zoom into this little frame, uh, you'll see the pixel grid come alive here. Now, when I started designing icons, what I realized was if I did them on a 10, like increments of 10, and then I wanted to size that icon to half size, what would end up happening is I would be on a half pixel. And I don't want to be on a half pixel. That's when things get blurry. Now, of course, you can always use the snapping to be able to snap here and there. But I just got in the practice of doing always in increments of 8, because no matter how small you get, if 8 is divided by 2, let's say you have a padding of 8, but you realize, oh, I'd like to actually half that padding. This also comes from being a front-end developer. A lot of times you're doing these sorts of things where you say, hey, I'd like to pad it by this, but then if you've got another padding layer deep, a nested child, you might actually take that padding in a variable and then cut it in half. So if you had a padding of 5 and then you cut it in half, now you have 2.5. And so now you're working with half pixels, which can create blurry lines and all kinds of problems. So if you do 8, 8 divided by 2 is 4, 4 divided by 2 is 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1, and so on and so forth. And so it's just a kind of bulletproof way to be able to make sure you don't get half pixels. Hope that was a good answer for you. All right, so let's take this avatar. Now, what I'd like to do is take this avatar component and then put it into here. And you can see, because I created a vertical auto layout frame for this, it just drops in vertically. And it's the spacing between these two items is defined by this here. This is going to be that spacing between items, which it says. All right, so normally what I would do now is I would just start typing in some text, because what I'd like to do is add like a username or something like that. So I'm going to put here username. The problem now is that I'm just designing inside of this frame, and these things are all laying out vertically. So in this case, I would probably just build this little component on the side. So I've got a username. Let's choose a font, and I'd like to do work sans. And let's make sure that that is a pretty bold name. We want those to stand out. And we'll go ahead and go with 16 pixels, just because that's going to be a good desktop legibility. The other thing we're going to want here is something to say like the username is playing this game. So I'm going to go ahead and just clone this little object here by alt dragging it. And we'll make this font just a little bit smaller. Now, I'm not spending a lot of time in these sessions working on like creating styles. If this was going to be a bigger project that I was going to expand on, I would probably start doing my text styles now, meaning this would be a small style, and I would probably come up here, hit plus, and put like body copy small, something like that. In this one here, we're going to go ahead and just go to medium weight. I'm going to put is playing video game. Okay, so the way that I want this thing to work is I want this to be centered vertically with this, but I want this whole thing to be able to grow in case this gets into 2 lines or whatever. So what I'm going to do here is just take these 2 text objects. I'm going to hit Shift A, and Figma knows, oh, these 2 things are on top of each other. Let's go ahead and use auto layout. And I'll go ahead and take these 2 text objects and make sure they're aligned to the left within the auto layout container. We can even test this and see if the frame grows. Yep, it does. Perfect. All right, and then the next thing I want to do is take these 2 items, and I'm going to create a auto layout container for these, like a horizontal one. If I hit Shift A, you can see that Figma once again knows that these 2 things were horizontally laid out. So it attempts to create a horizontal auto layout, and it attempts to get the spacing here. I'm going to put this spacing at 4. And let's see what else I've got. Yep, it's all good. I'd like this to be vertically centered to the avatar. Up here you see within this auto layout container, this child has this option of align center. I'd also like for this avatar to be align center. Now right now it didn't really do anything, but if I ever made this avatar bigger, you can see that I actually didn't architect that component right. But if I ever made it bigger, you can see that everything is centering just how I want. And I know this to be true of like when I'm designing websites or whatever. Oftentimes I will have something like this, and then I'll realize later, oh, I need to make that avatar a little bit bigger. Maybe it needs to be like 52 pixels or something like that. And if I don't set these up right, it's not going to work out great in the future. Now, if I'd like, I can go ahead and create a component out of this, and I think I will. I'm going to create a component, and I'm going to call this user status, I guess. Cool. So now we have a component, and that's indicated by this four little purple diamonds. And if I alt drag, I can now alt drag an instance of this into this component now. And now if I make any changes over here, here's the beauty of components, that it'll just reflect over there. But if I ever choose to override that component, and this is called technically component overrides, and I say this is Daisy, if I go back and I choose to rename this, it's not going to affect this object here because I've overridden it in the instance. It knows that, Figma knows that, so it doesn't give me a hard time. Let's adjust this spacing here. I'm going to go with 8 between because I think that looks good. All right, so we're getting started. I guess this fella is Daisy. That's perfect. I'm going to take this user status component that we just made, which is so masterfully created. Thank you, Roger. You did a good job. All right, so let's turn back on that grid again. And let's go ahead and align a few of these and just lay them out on here. Looks like maybe we didn't guess this perfectly. Maybe we need to just do this like this. This isn't perfectly centered. So I might need to make this component a little bit bigger here. Now, I don't really like the way this image is scaling. It's getting really long and thin. So my suggestion here, I'll show you a few little tricks to be able to deal with this, but I do know that this is currently a weakness of Figma, where when you have components like this and you resize them to a grid or you have auto layout, that only the width there is going to resize, and this object here is not constrained to like a ratio. So what I'm going to do is go into the master component here, which we actually haven't created one yet. So this is a perfect time to do this. I'm going to go ahead and resize this. Now, the reason I said the master component is because if it's an instance, you can't actually change the size of those things. So we'll go ahead and make this one our component here. So we're going to create a component out of it. I don't like having my master components actually within my frames because I feel like they get lost and you never really know where they're at. So I'm going to go ahead and take this one and move this over here with all of my components, and I'll just name this card. Now I can take an instance of this item, put it here, and I'm going to align it to the grid here. We're going to take an instance of this now component, and now we can see that it aligns up to the grid. Let's go ahead and move this up here. I'm going to go ahead and do 3 nudges down. Now, remember that these are all component instances. So what we can do now is override things within these. So say we want to have a different image here for this next one. I baked in a few different images here, but you could also just paste an image right into here. But I'm going to go ahead and just bring in Yoshi because he's awesome. Apparently, Yoshi's got some kind of double layered image. Aha, I see that. In Figma, you can actually stack images and fills. It's a really powerful thing, but sometimes you can get confused, like I was just there. And this one will just say Yoshi. And I can also override this component here if I want to go into this avatar instance and change this fill to maybe something else. Maybe I want a red background here just to indicate like what it might actually be like for a real user avatar here. And we'll take off Daisy and we'll go Mario there. I think I may have the double fill issue here with Mario, so I'll take care of that. And then I'm going to go ahead and just choose a different color for Mario, and we'll put Mario here. Also, of course, we can override this and say is playing whatever, Animal Crossing, whatever that is. Great. Let's change up these images so we have more of a realistic idea of what that content might be. I grabbed a few off the stream here. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab this one here. This will be Daisy. This one here. And what I'm doing is I'm just copying this fill out here with Command C. And then I'm coming here, and by holding Command, right now by default in Figma, if I actually just click that card, it doesn't actually, you don't see the image. Notice the fill's not here. So if I double click, then you can see that I'm down to this rectangle. But sometimes you have so many nested layers that you're double clicking, double clicking, double clicking. It's a horrible pain. So if I hold Command and then just click the item that I want, it'll actually drill right down into that item. And now I can just paste that image in here, that fill. I'll go ahead and pause for just a second, just in case there's any questions.
Raji, we have one. Can you quickly go over how to create instances?
No problem. So to create a component, it's as simple as this. Let's say I was making a button. I could actually just type in this, text button. I can take anything on the screen, I can click it, and I can just go up to this and hit create component. Now this creates the primary or master component, and to create an instance of this, all I have to do is copy paste. There can only be one primary component, so you notice the difference here on the screen. Here on the master component, you can see that it's got this little icon, but on this one, it's just a purple outlined item, and there's no icon up here. As you can see over here, you can see that it's got a different color purple icon, and that indicates that it's an instance. Another good way to know that this is an instance of something is that I can come over in this right-hand properties bar, and I can see that it says instance of. Oh, this is an instance of this text button. Of course, if I ever renamed this to just button, everything would live update. So now I'm over here. This is an instance of the button. This is the beauty of using components, is that you don't have to repeat yourself all the time. So say I wanted to have a beautiful red background. Notice it updates in the instance. If I wanted to have a little bit of rounded edges, and maybe I wanted some padding on this, or to create auto layout out of this, because right now, if I put my text in, you can see my text just bleeds out. But if I come to this button and create it to be an auto layout button, I can do that. I can also do that. I can do that by hitting Shift A, but I can also do that just by using the UI and hitting plus. And then I can go ahead and add some padding in. I think this is kind of the main way that I would suggest making a button. But notice now that because it is auto layout, that this button is resizing accordingly. And of course, if I wanted to make another instance, I could just option drag this off. That's like alt dragging, option dragging will create a copy of something, or I can just simply hit Command C, Command V, and boom, I've got that. Another way to do it would be to hit Command D, and Command D is duplicate. And I can just duplicate buttons like a madman. All right. So here we are with this. Now, we've got a really good structure now about like these cards. We've got some media here that showcases like what these people are doing. Cool mock-up, this is great. Now, let's try to take our first stab at making this into be a responsive layout. Gone are the days where we used to just design for a desktop. We're now designing for desktop and mobile devices and all sorts of devices in between. So I'm gonna go ahead and do my trick again, hold Option, drag on over, and I have a copy of this. I don't know if many of you know this, but there's this little frame menu up here. Now, up here, if you hit frame, you can see all these great presets for like, oh, I'd like to create a desktop mockup or a phone mockup. But at any given time, you can actually click on that frame and actually drop it down, and you can see all the different sizes. So I can just resize this thing. Now I want to show you this trick. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take off this grid. And we're going to do this like I would normally do this, like the same way that I did this last year. So I'm going to change this frame size to, let's say, a MacBook. Let's just go a little bit smaller. So I'm guessing you're thinking, oh, what a pain. Now, how do I do this? Do I like resize this? Like, do I go like this? Do I scale it this way? Okay, let me go back a little bit. Maybe I take these three and set up constraints. So I say like, I just want them centered, or I want them scaled. I've gone through all these things and all these woes trying to figure it out. Oh, okay, maybe this works. But the problem here is that, remember our spacing in between these? Remember how we had like this really smart gridded system, but this is just centering them and scaling them. And unfortunately, the spacing has changed. Notice that our margins and gutters are different. Over here, we have a really nice amount of like white space. And then we also have a really nice amount of white space in between the items, but this has gotten all compacted. So this is the trick that I learned just last week. Actually, I think I'm going to drop this into the chat. If you're new to Figma, if you're old to Figma, it doesn't really matter. This is a really, really great read, and apparently hasn't got a lot of views, but it's fantastic. Like, it really will help with design. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring back this layout grid. We'll go to desktop grid. Now, I always just thought that grids were just to help me align items. And then, of course, once I go back to this other size, let's go to this MacBook size, then I have to go adjust things once again. It really depends on the relationship between the grid and the items on it. So here's the trick. If I take these items here and I take them off of scale and I set them to left and right, instead of actually trying to align to the left and right of this frame, these should, fingers crossed, try to do their best job to align to the closest grid item. I've noticed also that I've got a little bit, I think maybe just my alignment's off. Yeah, my alignment's off on that. I think that one's fine. All right, great. Now we're going to test this theory out, and I hope I don't eat my words, but you can see now what's happening is that as I scale this, it's going to align to this grid as closely as it can. So I would recommend that we use this grid for maybe a variable amount of desktop ranges and maybe even like horizontally laid out iPads or whatever. But this is such a lifesaver, such a lifesaver. The only thing right now that really annoys me is the fact that these images, honestly, should be probably a desktop ratio. So as I move this in here, this desktop ratio, like, this isn't right anymore. Now there's square images, and that's not really a great way to set it up. Hey, I'm seeing mind blown. I spent a lot of time making sure I knew how to do this morning. Like I said, I just learned it. And when I learned it, my mind was blown too. So this is a really great little like trick to have in your box of tricks. And I would definitely advise that you read that article too, just to make sure you've got all the nuances of it. But it maintains all of our gutters and margins. So once again, if I change this frame, fingers crossed, let's see if it works out fine. It does. It's not just when I scale it, but it's also when I just change the frame size here. So once again, if I'm going to drag this item here and I'm going to copy it, maybe I could see how this layout's going to react with a different sized device. So let's go with something a little smaller. Well, now that we've got this here, this isn't quite working. So we're going to have to work on a different grid for this one. But we can definitely do this, and it really has made our job a lot easier. Okay, I'm going to show you another little trick here. And this one, I'm going to go ahead and file under pretty hacky. I believe that the Figma team right now is working on Auto Layout 3. And in Auto Layout 3, we should fix a lot of these little issues that we're facing right now with kind of like these resizing images. It's not so great. But we'll come over here and I'm going to showcase what I did. Now, remember, after this stream, I'm going to go ahead and share this file. I've got all the stuff prepped ahead of time, so I can share this. You can go dissect all these little things with these grids on them and then try to learn from that as well. I'm going to bring out something that I created here. And this is a card that I made earlier while I was practicing this. But notice that this here is the card and this is the instance of the card. But notice how we've actually been able to, I wouldn't say we've been able to maintain that aspect ratio, but I would say that we've been able to simulate it. So if I actually resize this, you can see here in a typical scenario, we're not able to go into this image and modify it. Notice here, I can't modify this. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep in this just because it is a bit hacky and I want to get to, I don't know, more valuable content and your questions. But I'm going to leave these little examples in the file for you. So in just a brief overview of how I broke this down, in this master component, I created something called a screenshot. And that's just a little media object. It's got a few things in it. And let's go find that screenshot here. Now, if you're ever like lost and you're in this component and you're here and you're like, oh, here's the instance, and I want to be able to find the master component, I can, of course, right-click that and go down to this master component menu and go to master component. It will zoom me on over to that master component. Now, the way that I worked this little hack out is that I actually created an auto layout frame within it and then a child object inside of it. Like I said, I don't think we'll have to use this workaround very much, but you can use it if it helps. But what this allows me to do by having this frame in here, I actually put the image on the frame, and then within this, I can actually go to this auto layout frame and I can change this spacing here. This is just leveraging the fact that auto layout spacing values can be overridden on instances. So for instance, if I just alt drag this out here, I can change the width of this, but I can come into this little frame here and I can just reduce the amount of vertical spacing on that. Ooh, what did I do? Oh, I had the master component somehow. I did not mean to do that. I can come into this little frame and I can actually reduce this. So I can come up with a simulation of that. This is a nice little thing in your bag of tricks, just because if you want to have that master component that works out for desktop, like my holy grail always is like, I want this card component. I want this thing to work for desktop, for mobile. I don't want to have to redo it. I don't want to have to redo it for mobile. And I want it to be able to scale too. So I think we've been able to achieve all those, albeit with this little bit of a hack here, but I would accept this. And then as soon as Figma releases auto layout free, baby, let's go. We don't have to use that hack anymore.
Raji, I just want to read you some of the comments. I'm seeing Big Brain. Yes, you beautiful man. Amazing. So it seems like that hack is resonating with people quite a bit. Do you want to take a handful of questions or do you want to keep going?
I'll take questions. I do want to say that I know sometimes I do demonstrate hacks on stream. And the reason I do it is because I've been designing this tool for a long time and I've run into the same frustrations you all have. And Figma is like my favorite design tool, but I do know that it has a few shortcomings and I know the team knows about it. So we are working on these things actively, but just to let you know, this is the reason I want to do it, is because I want you to still be able to move forward and get your designs done. All right, I'll take some questions. I'd love that.
Okay, awesome. Alana, I think that's how you pronounce it, wants to know, how do you make the text break a line and grow the component vertically?
Oh yeah, I can demonstrate that. We'll do it in like a smaller demonstration here. So let's say I have text here and I wanted to create that to be a component. So I can create a component, and the problem here is that like if I just hit return and type in, my component still actually has this real estate. That purple line around the text, that's really the size of the component. But the text within that component is actually bleeding out outside of it. So anytime you need a frame or a component can literally be just a frame that is turned into a component. Anytime that you need that, you can always just run auto layout. In fact, I'm going to back up real quick here because I don't think that we really need to even demonstrate this with a component. I can just simply put a frame around this by hitting Command Option or Command Alt G or Control Option G. And I now have a frame around this. And of course, if I put that second line in, you should see the same problem. Now this blue line around here is not resizing. And this may all seem fine and dandy, but if I put in a background color and now say I've got some cool like border radius to it, you can see the problem pretty clearly. So simply just take this frame, turn it into auto layout container. And right now, this is by default set up to a horizontal auto layout container. That means that if I add another object, let's say I just draw a little circle, like in the case of that avatar, things will line out horizontally. If I want to add another line of text though, even though it is technically laying those items out horizontally, it'll still grow vertically as well, because anything auto layout knows that it needs to grow both ways, or can grow both ways. If I simply just change this into a vertical auto layout container, and let's say I didn't want to hit that return button, I wanted to have a fixed width here. I can actually create a fixed width by dragging this out. Now, I've gotten a little bit lost with this in times before and then kind of figured this out. This container now is a vertical auto layout container. And if you see this little thing, pay attention to these little attributes. Right now, this is auto layout width. So if I keep typing this, this will keep expanding. And that may be frustrating because maybe you want a card to be a certain width. So if I take this and either click this and make it a fixed width, I can resize it. And now when I type my text in, it'll actually just bleed out. The other thing that I can do to convert it into a fixed width item is that I can actually just start dragging. And you'll see here that this icon, as soon as I start dragging, it turns over here into this fixed width item. Now we still got another problem, right? What's up with that? So here's a really cool thing that you can do. In an auto layout child, I can just tell, and what that simply means is this is a child element or a nested element of this parent frame, which is auto layout. In a vertical one, I can say, hey, just stretch this left and right. And if I do that, now it actually knows, oh, this is my full width. I don't have to keep growing. And I can just keep growing vertically, but not horizontally. I've hit my bounds. So hopefully that's a little bit of a trick for you or a bit of a help. We jumping in, Azra?
One more question. Can
Okay.
you explain the idea of baseline spacing?
Baseline spacing. I'd love a little bit more context on that question. I don't know if we're referring to typography or if we're referring to the idea of, for instance, here's a way to illustrate it. If these were set up to be horizontal, I'll just get the text out of here for this example, put a little bit of padding in here. Here could be an example of this. So if I duplicate these objects, it'll just keep growing, but those objects could be different sizes, right? So right now, these are all centered vertically here, but this here is essentially like a baseline. Now, I think we might be talking about typography, but this would align them to the baseline here of these objects. Would love to get more context on that question though.
Well, we'll see if Caitlin comes back in with some context. She's back. Typography specifically, how do you measure from the text itself or from the edge of the auto layout frame?
Still a little bit confused by that one. But I think generally speaking, the idea of baseline, so if we've got text here, you can see here, there's two things that we can see. One is this, this bounding box, but we can also see this line here. And sometimes that text will go below that blue line, but this is that baseline here. Curves often go below it because it's like an optical illusion. The curves actually have to dip below just a bit so that it can appear that it's on the baseline. So I still don't quite know what you mean by the baseline spacing here. Yeah, are we? She might be talking about red lines, like where you would actually measure from the baseline to a container. Maybe that's that.
I'm not sure, but we'll give her some time to come back. If she has additional questions, you can keep going for the sake of time.
Yeah, and so I've heard a lot with that baseline, like baseline measurements in the web or when I've designed for digital products. I don't use baseline spacing anymore as far as when we're talking about distance from that to the baseline to the edge of a frame. But somebody did tell me once about this. They had this question and we were kind of working through it. I believe that there's a plugin called Redlines, and this might actually help you with that handoff or help you with measuring spaces in between. But we'll move on and we'll go ahead and continue. All right. So we've talked about some basics here. One thing that I wanted to do is like, what if we had added a header to this? So maybe this isn't like Dribbble or Instagram where it's just this feed. What if we had some prioritized content for this? So I'm going to go ahead and just move this down. And you've seen this a lot on websites, right? Like you've seen this big header bar, and that header bar has maybe like promoted things in there. Maybe it's a promoted streamer or it's a promoted thing. It could be like a video game or something. Maybe a company's paying money so that I can promote that. So let's just talk about how we might lay that out. I'm just going to draw this frame here. Let's give it a color. So I'm going to fill, and I'm going to choose a color for now. Just use this dark color from our styles. And so my question here would be like, what if we had like a bigger stream? Like, so I want to have a live embed. These aren't necessarily live embeds. These are just little cards indicating that you can go off and click, but maybe I want something to be playing right here. So we're going to go ahead and design that. Let's design something a little bit differently that maybe takes up more real estate, but we still want to respond to this grid that we've created. So let's jump right in on that. I'm going to use a frame here because I think I'm going to probably use constraints, but let's just say this one's going to be bigger. This one's going to be like maybe this big. I'm going to actually ditch this one for now. I'm going to just draw this on this grid. I don't want to be confused by that other thing that was going on. We've got that other frame, and right now I just kind of want to design in secrecy, and I want to build the design in confidence here. So I'm going to add, let's just add that same card style here. I wish that we had design tokens. That means that we would be able to borrow this value 16, but I just have to remember it. Hopefully one day we have that. Now I want to be able to add like a live embed of this stuff. So we're going to need a video. We'll just borrow this one here, and we're going to pretend like this is a video. Now I want this to go all the way over here, and I want it to be, yeah, say about that big. I think the size I looked up on Twitch was like 530 by 300. So I'm going to go ahead and attempt to do that. I'll go ahead and move these things down just a bit to get out of our way. Right, I'm going to move that down to the bottom here. Now, one thing we don't have to do is we don't necessarily have to put the border radius on this item. So if I take this off, you'll notice that, we'll go ahead and turn off this grid just a second so you can see. You'll notice that even though I took that off, the border radius is still there. And that's because we have this clip content turned on. Clip content can be pretty annoying sometimes because say you've got some text and the text is at the bottom of this frame and the G or the descender of that text is actually hanging off. Clip content will actually clip that. Always remember that. If you ever feel like your text is getting cut off because it's in a frame or an auto layout frame, if you uncheck this clip content, you can see what happened here. That these edges of this thing actually went back to square. Let's see what we did here. And because the border radius is actually on the frame, it's still got that rounded edge. Now, if I just hit clip content in this case, it's actually what I want. Now you can see that this edge is rounded off here. All right, let's get some text and bring in that avatar thing here. So we're going to bring in Daisy here, and I'm going to paste it right here on this frame. I'm going to bring back my grids, and that's going to be Control G to bring back the grids. So I'm trying to find the closest grid line that allows me to still be on this grid. Now notice when I resized this frame that this image is stretching, and I don't really want it to stretch. I want it to just say this exact same ratio. So what I can do here, within this frame, I can set the constraints. Now all these constraints of a child object within a frame are relative to the frame. So if I set this to, I want this to be on the left, and I want this to be on the top and the bottom, it essentially will pin that image into those positions. So if I actually start stretching this way, notice that it doesn't move anymore. It's pinned to that left side. Great. So now I'm going to bring in this avatar here. And let's see, I want it to be centered. Let's drop that in. If you're ever missing the frame here, I'll show you a little trick. For some reason, it's not going into that frame. I can actually just take it. Now that's this frame here. I can just drop it right in there. And now if I turn this off and on, you can see it's actually contained within that frame. One little tip is if you ever are dragging this outside of this frame and you get frustrated because maybe you just dragged it a little bit over here to the edge and it popped out and now you want it in the frame. Sometimes you'll have elements like notification dots Those things will be on the outside, and they still technically need to move with this frame here. What you can do is hold shift as so start dragging, then hold shift. So I can actually have this thing still within this frame right here, and it doesn't move out. And I can actually plant it off the side or maybe just slightly up here. That's a really good little tip. All right, so the next thing is maybe we're gonna want some text for this. Like we wanna say what Daisy's doing and like what's the synopsis, what's she actually doing in this game, like is she playing with a bunch of different players. So we're gonna have some copy here. I just borrowed this from this little subheading here. I'm actually gonna change this because it's annoying me to this lighter gray. One thing I wanted to talk to you really quick about, and I always want to bring this up, is about accessibility of text. So let's turn off this grid. I wanted to share with you a quick plugin. It's called Contrast. If you go right on out here and go, I have the community beta, but what you might see is something that looks like plugins. If you just search for Contrast here, this will be the plugin I want to talk about. We want to make sure that this text is going to be legible on this gray background box. So a little trick here is to use Command or Control / it'll open up the menu here, and I can type in contrast here. This contrast is a plugin that I can now determine whether or not this text is accessible, but it automatically knows the background that it's on. So you can see here that this gray text, as much as I love it aesthetically, it's not really working. It is failing all of these contrast ratios, which basically says people that don't have sight that's perfect, they're probably not going to be able to see this. And this isn't even about people that can't see very well. It's also just about general accessibility for, like, what if you're on your laptop and you're not in a dungeon of a cave with a bright screen in front of you? What if you're on your laptop out in the sun? This probably wouldn't work. So we can go here and just change that to some different values here and see now, oh, this is working out. Or maybe I can just adjust this a little bit to something else. Like this is working out for normal text, but I can see that maybe for the AAA, you can read more up on this later, but you can see that that maybe won't work. So I can set this text now to this more accessible value here. And then I can, this will be my little copy area. I'm going to go ahead and just pin this here, and set this to right and bottom. Then I have a bunch of text I can throw in here. Now let's see how this all responds. Not so great. Now, once again, we don't need this to be responsive. So maybe we don't need to worry about constraints because right now this is a fixed width item on the screen. So let's go ahead and do that. If we ever need a grid that's different than the grid here, so if I turn on this grid, I've got this columnar grid. But if I ever need something that's a little bit different, I can always create a grid on my frame. So if I hit layout grid, notice I now have this 8-pixel grid that I can align to on this frame. Let's go ahead and just give this a little bit more room. I'm going to bring this way out here. Might be a little bit too much, but we'll go ahead and stick with that. We're going to align this to this grid gap here. And then I'm just going to bring this over here. This hopefully would be filled with much more text. So this would be maybe some tags, things like that. I can also adjust my line height here to be more readable. With body copy, you're going to probably want that to be more up towards 120, 130%, maybe even 140%. As you start getting larger bodies of text. Great. So let's see. We probably do want this to do a little bit of responding. But before I do that, I want to address any questions, but I'd like to be able to get this frame here to also stay on that grid and adjust just a little bit. But let's go ahead and get some questions if we've got them.
Raji, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We have 5 more minutes left, so why don't you finish this piece and then we can answer the rest of these on Twitter.
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and just jump into the questions. Okay, I think it may take me a little longer to pull this off. So before I actually publish this file, I'll go ahead and finish designing this up, and I'll go ahead and publish it, and that way you'll see an example of how this thing can do a little bit of sizing to the grid.
Perfect.
But I think we'll stop here.
Okay. Well, a question we just got from Andrew is how do you export this to HTML?
Andrew, we have a couple of plugins out there. Now, I've tried them a few times. They don't do necessarily a great job. Exporting to HTML is something that Figma doesn't necessarily do. That's going to be something that you'll probably have to talk to developers about. But also, you can absolutely attempt to do this with that plugin. I think there's something called an export to HTML, and it may do a good enough job depending on how complex your layout is. So let's see. Tell you what, Andrew, I'll look and see. Why don't you hit me up on Twitter, and we'll see if we can find the best plugins for this, and I'll ask around a little bit. And let's move on to the next question to see if we can find something for you.
Awesome. Do you have any workarounds for getting horizontal auto layout objects to stretch horizontally?
Workarounds for getting, well, I think fundamentally the reason that you want to set something. So I would ask the question, why is it that you want to be able to stretch? Why is it in its nature, horizontal auto layout says, I want these things to adjust horizontally with the content inside, but you're saying, oh, but I want it to be able to adjust anyway. So I would ask if there's maybe another way about going about laying out your content. And absolutely, if you've got a file that you want me to look at, hit me on Twitter, hit me on email, send me that file. I'll be happy to jump in with you and maybe see if there's a creative solution. I think without knowing the true nuance of exactly what you're trying to achieve, I don't know if I can answer the question best just on this stream.
We have a question from Elena that I can answer, but where do we usually publish these work in progress files? We usually post the videos on YouTube, and we'll include the file in the description as well, but then we'll send an email at the end of the week recapping this live stream and the one for tomorrow, and you'll be able to see it then. We also send out what we call like a live stream digest that tells you everything that we've done in 2 weeks and what's coming up for the 2 weeks, so you'll be able to see those files there. Cool.
I saw another question coming too from Gauntla. There's a website out there that actually, so the question is, do you know of any hacks for exporting Figma to Sketch? There's a website out there that actually does almost all the formats. I don't remember what it was, but I would just say like export or import Figma to Sketch or something like that, convert Figma to Sketch. I've tried it. It worked pretty well. The technologies underlying these tools are a little bit different, so you may not be able to retain these things like auto layout and things like that, just because I know under the hood they do them a little bit differently.
I think that's all the time we have for questions today. If you all have any other questions for Raji, you can always find him on Twitter. He's pretty quick to answer there. And then if you learned something interesting today, or you want to continue having conversations about anything that we went over today, Twitter is a great place to go.
Yeah, so just to let you know, once again, we've got future live streams available for you to register for at figma.com/events. My personal email is rking@figma.com. Osro, maybe you can just plant that into the chat. But I'm happy to take any emails. I would love to help you. I'd love to unblock you from any things that are maybe you're running into or struggling with, but also hear you out. Maybe there's something we can improve this tool on. So would love to be able to do that. Of course, I'm at twitter.com/Raji as well. So I'm happy to take DMs or anything and help you out. Really appreciate you coming.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks all. Have a good one. Happy designing.